Emily Harper stood on her front porch watching the moving truck pull into the driveway next door, and her coffee mug trembled slightly in her hands because she hadn't expected anyone to move into old Mrs. Henderson's house so soon after the funeral, and certainly not him. And when Jake Thompson stepped out of the driver's seat, looking nothing like the lanky teenager she remembered, her breath caught somewhere between shock and something she didn't want to name, because this wasn't the boy who used to trip over his own shoelaces while chasing fireflies in the summer twilight, and his shoulders had broadened into the kind of frame that filled doorways, and his once messy hair now fell perfectly across his forehead in that effortlessly attractive way that made her stomach flip like she was 16 again instead of 34 and married and supposedly content with her predictable life in their quiet Charlotte suburb. Mark called from inside asking if she wanted more toast, but Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the man lifting boxes with an easy strength that made her feel things she had no business feeling. And when Jake finally glanced up and caught her staring, that slow recognition spreading across his face turned into a smile that hit her like lightning on a clear day. And he raised one hand in a casual wave that somehow felt intimate, like they shared a secret nobody else could understand. And she waved back with a nervousness that annoyed her, because she was a grown woman who'd been married for 12 years and shouldn't be this affected by an old neighbor returning home. The rest of that Saturday passed in a blur of stolen glances through kitchen windows and unnecessary trips to check the mailbox, and by evening, when Mark suggested they take some welcome cookies next door, Emily's heart hammered against her ribs with an intensity that felt both thrilling and terrifying, because she knew something fundamental had shifted the moment their eyes met, and crossing that driveway with a plate of chocolate chip cookies felt like stepping toward a cliff she couldn't see the bottom of, but somehow couldn't resist approaching anyway. The neighborhood barbecue 2 weeks later became the moment everything changed. And Emily had convinced herself she could handle casual conversation with Jake, but the summer heat wrapped around them like a living thing, and she found herself gravitating toward him despite every internal warning screaming at her to stay beside Mark, who was busy discussing golf handicaps with their neighbor Tom and completely oblivious to the electricity crackling between his wife and the man flipping burgers near the grill. And Jake's eyes followed her movements all evening with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. And when he finally approached with 2 beers, his smile carried a hint of mischief that reminded her of the boy who used to dare her to climb higher in the oak tree between their childhood homes. They started talking about innocent things like his new job in financial consulting and her work as a freelance graphic designer. But somehow the conversation drifted into dangerous territory when he mentioned how he'd always thought she was the prettiest girl on the block and how he'd been too shy to ever tell her. And Emily felt her cheeks flush as she deflected with a joke about his awkward phase. But Jake leaned closer, smelling like expensive cologne and summer rain, and whispered that he wasn't that awkward kid anymore. And she could see that, couldn't she? And the way he looked at her made every nerve ending in her body wake up after years of comfortable numbness. That night, Emily lay beside Mark, feeling like a stranger in her own bed. And when her phone buzzed with a text from Jake saying how good it was to see her again, she stared at those simple words for 20 minutes before responding. And thus began a pattern of late-night messages that started innocently enough with shared memories and childhood stories, but gradually transformed into something more confessional and intimate. And Jake admitted he'd moved back partly because he'd never forgotten her. And Emily knew she should stop responding, but the attention fed something starving inside her that Mark's predictable affection had long stopped nourishing. The thunderstorm hit on a Wednesday evening 3 months after Jake's return, and Mark had left that morning for a business conference in Atlanta and wouldn't be back until Friday. And Emily had been cleaning the kitchen when lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that shook the windows. And then came the knock on her door, soft but insistent. And when she opened it, Jake stood there, completely soaked, his white shirt clinging to his chest and his hair dripping water down his face. And he looked vulnerable and dangerous all at once, as he asked if he could come in just to dry off because his power had gone out. And Emily's common sense battled with desire, but she stepped aside and let him enter, knowing this decision would change everything. She handed him a towel and tried to maintain distance, but the small space of her living room felt impossibly intimate with the storm raging outside. and Jake dried his face slowly, never breaking eye contact, and then he said her name in a way that made it sound like a confession, like a prayer, like something forbidden and beautiful, and Emily felt her resolve crumbling as he moved closer, explaining that he hadn't really come because of the storm, but because he couldn't stop thinking about her and couldn't keep pretending these feelings didn't exist. And his hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and the touch sent electricity through her that had nothing to do with the lightning flashing outside. She knew she should ask him to leave, should remind him and herself that she wore a wedding ring that meant something, or at least used to mean something. But instead, she found herself asking, what feelings? And Jake's answer came not in words, but in the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And he admitted he'd been in love with her since they were kids, and moving back wasn't about a job opportunity, but about a chance he'd regretted not taking 15 years ago. And Emily felt tears burning behind her eyes, because part of her had been waiting to hear those words her whole life, even though they came at the worst possible time, from the most dangerous person. What happened next felt inevitable, like the storm outside had swept away all her defenses. And when Jake kissed her, it wasn't gentle or tentative, but hungry and desperate, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring years of suppressed longing into that moment. And clothes fell away, inhibitions dissolved, and they stumbled toward the couch, where Emily betrayed her marriage vows with a passion she'd forgotten existed. And afterward, lying tangled together, listening to the rain, she felt simultaneously alive and destroyed, knowing she'd crossed a line she could never uncross, but unable to regret the crossing, because for the first time in years, she felt something other than numb. The affair consumed Emily like wildfire over the following months, and she became a master of deception, sneaking next door whenever Mark worked late and inventing book club meetings and grocery runs that lasted hours while she lay in Jake's arms in his renovated bedroom with its exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that made every encounter feel reckless and thrilling because anyone could see. And that danger became part of the intoxication, and Jake was insatiable, not just physically but emotionally, wanting to know everything about her marriage and why she stayed and what Mark couldn't give her. And each conversation pulled her deeper into a fantasy where leaving her old life seemed not just possible but necessary. Jake's newly decorated house became their sanctuary, and Emily found herself comparing everything to Mark, and her husband always came up short, because Mark kissed her like an obligation, while Jake kissed her like she was oxygen, and Mark talked about retirement plans and lawn maintenance, while Jake whispered about running away together to California or Montana, or anywhere they could start fresh without the weight of her marriage hanging over them. And the more Jake pushed, the more conflicted Emily became, because part of her wanted exactly what he offered, but another part recognized that walking away from 12 years of marriage would destroy not just Mark, but her parents and their entire social circle, and the reputation she'd carefully built in their tight-knit community. The close calls started happening more frequently, and one Saturday afternoon, they were in Jake's kitchen, barely dressed, when Mark knocked on the front door asking to borrow a ladder, and Emily hid in the bedroom, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode, while Jake calmly handed over the ladder and made small talk about the weather. And after Mark left, Jake found the terror on her face amusing, pulling her close and joking that the danger made everything more exciting. But Emily couldn't laugh because she'd seen how easily their secret could shatter and take everyone down with it. Mark began noticing changes, asking why she seemed distracted during dinner and why she jumped whenever her phone buzzed and why she'd started wearing perfume to the grocery store. And Emily's lies multiplied like weeds, each one requiring 3 more to cover it up. And she invented a fictional friend named Sarah, who supposedly needed emotional support through a divorce. And Mark bought it at first because he trusted her implicitly, the way people trust things they've never questioned. But his questions grew more pointed, and one night he picked up her phone while she showered, and though she deleted the messages, Jake's contact name alone, Emily's Jake with a heart emoji, told a story that made Mark's face go pale when she emerged wrapped in a towel. The confrontation exploded on a cold November evening when Mark came home early from work and found Emily's car in the driveway, but Emily wasn't home, and he'd walked next door with a sick feeling in his stomach and knocked until Jake answered, shirtless, with guilt written across his face. And Mark didn't need to see Emily hurrying down the stairs, buttoning her blouse, to understand what had been happening literally next door for months. And the sound Mark made wasn't quite a scream or a sob, but something in between. And Emily had never seen such devastation in another person's eyes, and she knew in that moment she'd broken something that could never be repaired. Mark didn't yell or throw things, but spoke in a quiet voice, more terrifying than rage, asking how long and how many times, and whether she'd ever loved him at all. And Emily couldn't answer because the truth seemed cruel and lies seemed pointless. And Jake tried to interject, saying he loved Emily and they hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But Mark turned on him with such fury that Jake actually stepped back. And Mark said, "You don't get to talk about love while destroying someone else's marriage in the house next door, where I have to see you every single day." And the weight of what they'd done crashed over Emily as she watched her husband's world crumble. The divorce proceedings were brutal and humiliating because their neighborhood was small and gossip spread like disease. And suddenly, Emily was the woman who'd thrown away a good marriage for her childhood crush, and people who'd smiled at her for years crossed the street to avoid her. And even her own mother called her selfish, asking how she could do this to Mark, who'd been nothing but devoted and faithful. And Jake promised they'd get through it together, that their love was worth the fallout. But as weeks turned into months, Emily noticed Jake pulling away, overwhelmed by the reality of being the man who destroyed a marriage, and the fantasy they'd built in stolen moments couldn't survive the harsh light of consequence. Emily ended up alone in a small apartment across town because Jake eventually admitted he wasn't ready for the commitment he'd promised, and maybe he'd been in love with the idea of her more than the reality. And Mark refused to speak to her, even through lawyers, and she'd lost her husband, her home, her community, and the man she'd risked everything for, all because she'd confused desire with love and excitement with happiness, and couldn't resist the temporary thrill of feeling wanted. And as she sat in her empty living room on Christmas Eve, she finally understood that the innocent boy next door had never really become a tempting man, but rather she'd projected her own unhappiness onto him and used him as an escape from problems in her marriage she'd been too cowardly to address honestly. The lesson carved itself into her bones through lonely nights and therapy sessions, where she learned that betrayal destroys not just relationships, but the betrayer's own integrity, and that passion without commitment is just selfishness dressed in romantic language, and that the grass isn't greener on the other side, but only greener where you water it. And Emily's failure wasn't falling for Jake, but in never communicating her needs to Mark, in choosing deception over honesty, and in believing she deserved happiness at any cost, even if that cost was another person's devastation and trust. And though she couldn't undo the damage, she could at least learn that real love requires courage to be vulnerable and honest, even when it's uncomfortable, and that sometimes the most attractive choice is also the most destructive, and recognizing the difference requires wisdom she'd lacked but painfully earned.